Hello all, I hope you're wearing your war paint and you have your battle axe in hand as we pillage that little treasure trove of fantasy gaming to take a look at the Barbarian as it appears in Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Diablo, and many other fantasy and pseudo-fantasy settings in gaming as we know it today. It did not, after all, pop out of Gary Gygax's head as a subclass of fighter back in first edition D&D. Gary Gygax was the inheritor of an entire literary tradition full of tropes when he created what we would recognize as the barbarian class in D&D. He based this on Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian, Gardner Fox's Kothar, and even Fritz Lieber's Fafhrd, and I hope I said that last one right. But even these authors and artists drew on much older traditions to create the archetypes that we would recognize as the barbarian in gaming today. I was already somewhat familiar with these traditions when I picked up 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons for the first time and saw the barbarian class in there. But I was a young teenager. I think I was 13 at the time, so I wasn't thinking of it in the analytical context I do today. But I could still recognize it as having similarities to many figures from other stories I had read before, and this bred a familiarity. So even without reading all of the rules, I had some idea what the class was about just by the picture of Krusk and the brief description in the opening paragraphs. And as you look at the details of the class in 3.0, back when I first started gaming, that should give you some idea of how old I am by what D&D edition I started with. You could see what we tend to associate with the barbarian. Slightly lighter armor than the fighter, but they are big, strong, tough. They fly into rages that allow them to perform near superhuman feats. They're associated with the wilderness, are often considered illiterate or uncultured, and in the case of 3.0, were illiterate unless you took the effort to make sure your character knew how to read and write a language. This is traditionally a powerhouse character, and this sort of archetype is recognizable in 4th edition, 5th edition, in Diablo, in Pathfinder, and in other games as well. I can even spot a lot of those tropes in classes that are not called the Barbarian, but still bear all the hallmarks and tropes that we would likely associate with the Barbarian. So what makes the Barbarian narratively distinct as a class and such a prominent fixture in fantasy? That's the question we're going to be answering here. I'm not going to be looking at the rules of a particular system, except perhaps in the context of how the barbarian is embodied. I'm actually going to be looking at the barbarian as it exists in fantasy gaming as a whole right now and in the past. And if you look at fantasy gaming, it is logical to conclude that the origins of the barbarian lie in Western folklore, literature, and philosophy. And the beginnings of what we would recognize as the barbarian that leads adventuring parties in Dungeons and Dragons comes all the way to us from ancient Greece. This is actually where we get the term barbarian, or barbaros in this case. Because barbarians go bar, 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 bar. They don't speak the language of civilized people. Even the very name itself is an insult. The best way to understand barbarian as the Greeks would have is as outsider, someone who is not Greek. So it is an ethnographic distinction in its earliest formation. Someone who is not one of us. Someone who is the other. Most notably, this also applied to people who were not practitioners of classical Greek customs. Now, a lot of what we know about ancient Greece comes from the Athenians. So when I talk about Greek culture, recognize that it is going to be Athens-centric. but that's sadly what we have to deal with when studying a great deal of classical Greek civilization. Athenian tropes that relate to the barbarian sort of developed alongside slavery, which is common, even ubiquitous, all throughout Greece. So this is something that many Greek philosophers would have taken as the norm. And while the nature of slavery and how some people are slaves and some people are freemen is something debated in Greek philosophy, it's largely in Greek culture at the time we're talking about a norm. And Athens in particular had a massive influx of slaves. And note that I'm talking about the Athenian democracy of about 500 BC, and of course the years after that. This is the time period I'm really looking at. Chattel slavery had grown to such proportions that even many poor families owned a handful of slaves, 3, 4, 5, something like that. So you had a massive population of people who were foreigners taken in battle, and Greeks that were not Athenians who didn't have the rights of Athenians and were property of the Athenians. And this naturally came with certain social divides beyond the privileges of citizenship and the obvious lack of privileges that come with being a slave. There were differences between the Greek slaves and the barbarian slaves, the foreign slaves. And this mass up close and personal interaction between foreigners and Athenian citizens is really the impetus behind the increasing cultural awareness and formation of this conception of the barbarian. And this cultural distinction ended up feeding into what we would recognize as the stereotypes of, well, what I just said, barbarians. People who often lacked Greek reason and skills, especially since the Greeks associated reason so strongly with their language. And this idea would slowly develop over time and be shaped in different ways. After all, the Greeks depicted the Persians rather differently from the way they depicted the Celts. So there was this recognition of different types of barbarians. The Persians would often be considered overly effeminate, cowardly, prone to debauchery, and lacking the Greek will for freedom. The Persians would often be depicted as despots in Athenian culture. You can see echoes of this in the film 300, even though it's focused on the Spartans, who were very despotic. And by our standards, so were the Athenians. Anyway, you would see this as very different from the animal skin wearing Celts and Germanic warriors who were vicious, feral, and inhuman. In both of these cases, the Greeks often styled themselves as the defender of Greek freedom, Greek culture, and thus of civilization. You can see this represented a lot in the political philosophies of Athenians throughout the history of classical Athens. You can see this in art and things like the dying Galatian statue. You can see this in a lot of political propaganda and even in epitaphs and graffiti of the time. You also saw admiration become a part of this whole idea of the barbarian as well. The construction of the noble savage. While it was possible to still be barbaric in the ways that, say, the Gauls were, they also displayed virtues the Greeks could recognize and value. And this noble savage tradition in literature survives in a form today. We're probably very familiar with the colonial version of it and the post-colonial version, but the Greeks had their own. And later, the Romans would adopt the idea of the noble savage and the concept of barbarian as a whole from the Greeks. It is really from the Romans that we get the version of it that we're most likely to recognize. They saw themselves as the inheritors of the Greek tradition, even while viewing the Greeks themselves as a form of barbarian. While the Romans recognized value in Greek culture, saw speaking Greek to be a sign of well, being quite elite and educated and cultured, nonetheless, the Greeks were a foreign power whose ways were not trusted. And indeed, association with the Greeks would be used to taint Mark Antony, particularly because of his relationship with Cleopatra. And this would allow Augustus, or at the time Octavius, to turn Roman sentiment against Mark Antony, styling Antony as corrupted by barbarian influence and Octavius as the true defender of Roman veritas and culture. So there is a great deal of fear and xenophobia associated with the barbarian, even when the barbarian can display virtues. In the case of the Greeks, the Romans considered them very educated. They really hated Greek lawyers and sophists, though, or the equivalent of sophists. That was not their thing. Similarly, the Romans greatly valued the warrior spirit of the Gauls, the Germans, the Celtiberians, even while despising their brutality, or what the Romans characterized as brutality. And some of this is also rooted in fear, considering the early sack of Rome by the Gauls before Rome's rise to power. I think this fear permeates a great deal of Roman culture. And you can see the formation and hybridization early on of the Roman conception of the barbarian in the writings of Polybius, a Greek who was living in Roman captivity. Polybius had to explain in his writings, well, how did Rome go from this minor Italian state to the dominant power of the Mediterranean? I mean, any Greek observer during the wars between Carthage and Rome, the Punic Wars, would have thought Carthage the likely winner and the more civilized of the two. So in Polybius's explanation of the Roman victory, he ends up associating Roman culture and, in a way, the barbaric virtues of the Romans, a sort of noble savage construct, with the reason for their success. Likewise, the Romans would end up ascribing barbarian values to others, creating noble savages of certain groups and evil pillagers or nefarious, cowardly women men of others. And to be effeminate in the Roman understanding is a deep insult. Thus, the way they viewed more effeminate barbarians would not have been very positive. So, if you understand that, you can understand the context of, say, Livy's work, which constructs the tale of Roman rise to power and the whole notion of using the barbarians as a framing device, going, well, Rome rose because of her civic virtue, but she must be wary against of luxury and avarice that could defeat the Romans from within. Barbarians became a sort of morality tale in the works of many Roman authors. If you study Livy, if you study Tacitus, if you study Gaius Julius Caesar, even at some points, or, oh gosh, I cannot remember his name for the life of me. Sallust, that's his name. Sallust, that would be the one. A lot of the works of Roman historians are moralistic in nature. They're not just designed to recount historical events, they are designed to teach lessons with the recounting of these events. Thus, certain stock tropes tend to appear in these tellings. The barbarians are defeated from within before they ever face the Romans by the lack of some key virtue. This is what allows the Romans to triumph, at least the Romans who hold to the key important virtues. And when the Romans do not, the Romans and the Roman moral failings are the root of their own undoing. And you can even see this used in military works like that of Vegetius, as he applies the idea of Roman moral failings and this need to get back to good old Roman virtue as a key component of fixing the Roman Empire. Now, Vegetius wrote so late in the Western Roman Empire's lifetime that he would never see a rejuvenation of the West. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, in the form of the Byzantine Empire, would survive for quite some time, up into the Crusades, but the Western Roman Empire, not so much. And you'll note that I've been talking about the Roman Empire and including authors who wrote in the time of the Roman Republic. I've just used the term Roman Empire to count for both the Republic and the post-Augustan system. In the wake of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, these images and tropes associated with barbarians would remain in storytelling, in some cases merged knowingly or unknowingly with the very barbarian peoples who occupied and divvied up what used to be the Roman Empire, often to legitimize themselves or to merge their culture with something they valued. Indeed, many of the barbarians that came to the Roman Empire, including the man that sacked it, Alaric, he wanted to reap the benefits of Roman life and only accepted his title as King of the Goths because of Roman mistreatment and the fact that he could never get that general's position that he wanted. And you would even see with the Carolingian Empire that would eventually rise up from all this mess, the restyling as a successor to the Roman Empire. So a lot of these traditions in storytelling survive in the Roman form. Thus, the barbarian remains a figure in storytelling that serves a moralistic role. You would have the barbarians who are a threat from outside that can tear down civilization, and you have the barbarians who display virtues that the more civilized men can learn from while still displaying traits of being uncivilized and thus in some way undesirable. These traditions of the barbarian storytelling would be revitalized during the Renaissance, especially with a fixation on the classics of Greece and Rome, and thus would make their way into Enlightenment thinking and so on and so forth. Well, how does all this relate back to the D&D style of Barbarian? Well, fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons drew a lot of their inspiration from legends and folklore, not to mention works of literature that were also inspired by legends and folklore, thus are the inheritors of many of the stock tropes in those mediums. And since a lot of legends and folklore were moralistic in nature and included figures like the barbarian would naturally come along for the ride. And note that the barbarian is not a purely Western phenomenon. The barbarian in Roman and Greek conception has the most influence in the Western fantasy game genre, but virtually every culture has their own idea of barbarians. For the Arabs, they had the Arabic Ajam, non-Arab speakers, and I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the word for mute, and it also references people whose mother tongue isn't Arabic. Thus, it becomes a conception of an outsider. These terms can take on ethnographic connotations. India and China have their own terms for barbarian. So do the Japanese. We recognize the term outsider, gaijin, in a lot of Japanese popular culture. And this is just the tip of the spear in terms of what exactly you see in cultures with their own conception of the barbarian, and in storytelling, the barbarian tends to fill the same moralistic role as the Western barbarian, either an outside cultural and physical threat or a noble savage archetype. Because of advancements in technology and increased interaction between different ethnic and cultural groups that has led to xenophobia becoming something of a cultural taboo despite still running incredibly strong, it's often hard for modern people, particularly those who have access to the internet and live the first world lifestyle, to truly conceptualize how deep xenophobia runs in cultural influence throughout the world. And largely throughout our history, people and groups have been threatened by outsiders, and their culture largely reflects that. Regardless of whether we look at it as a bad or a good thing, this is just what narratives tend to teach us about how these people thought about things, and the idea of the barbarian tends to reflect that, both as a threat and as a potential figure to learn from. And we see an entire gamut between pillager and noble savage. But in all cases, the barbarian is not a truly civilized figure and sits outside of the culture, deeming that figure as a barbarian. And this is one of the dominant facets of the barbarian in Western fantasy gaming. The barbarian is an outsider to the civilized world. Now, civilization is a relative term in real life. Civilization and sophistication are ideas that we apply to complex human systems and rate by an arbitrary cultural means. And when these are depicted in art, they tend to be simplified into a set of tropes that can never truly depict the complexities of human behavior and society. Still, the barbarian is always an other to the society looking outward to the barbarian, even if they can see some of themselves in that barbarian and identify with them on some level. And there's been a long tradition of outsider heroes, people who exist outside the law and are not restrained in the same way a civilized or normal person is, and these are people that we can look up to. So it's no surprise that some barbarians have become the heroes of their own stories. The literary baseline is there to build up into a dynamic hero figure we can get behind. Also, a lot of the noble savage, more good-aligned barbarians that we see in fiction, or see dubbed as virtuous barbarians by whatever culture is doing the dubbing, tend to have extant physical attributes that are positive in nature. And this brings us back to the Greek conception of hero as someone who does great things. Now, by modern standards, many of the Greek heroes are pretty shitty people, and even by Greek standards, some of the Greek heroes are pretty shitty people, but they still did great deeds. Terrible, but great. Ah, Harry Potter. Anyway, that is core to understanding that deed is central to the heroic figure. To many pagan cultures, the idea of someone doing great deeds is enough to make them a great figure, where if you look at many of the Abrahamic faiths and heroes associated with the Abrahamic tradition, they display great moral character over great physical feats. The physical feats are attributed to God or gifts of God. And moral character is very important in many pagan mythologies and legends and folk tales, so don't think that they're not. But the Christian version of faith as the central virtue, and people holding to that faith, that's a big-time Abrahamic hero trait. And while in many pagan traditions the gods can interact with mortals and give them gifts, sometimes the mortals are just that badass, or got their gifts as the result of divine sperm. I mean, hey, Zeus really got around. And don't even get me started on the Norse gods. That's just a total mess. But looking at the hero as someone who does great things, you see the hallmarks of certain heroes being present. Let's look at the three different types of heroes that you often see in fiction, how they can be applied to the barbarian. You have the physical hero. This is the action movie character, the professional weightlifter, the wrestler, the physical fighter, the brawler, the athlete, whatever. This is the person that we admire because of what they can physically do. And there's always been a cultural obsession with this. We hold up great warriors, our champion athletes, the best of whatever physical thing they do. We give them medals instead of participation awards because they're paragons in their particular field. And They are exemplars of whatever we're capable of. And when you look at the other, you can see exemplars there as well that you, as a civilized person, should aspire to. Thus, we already have a tendency to look at the virtues of figures who are deemed barbaric in fiction. And there are many physically powerful barbarians. If you look even back to the Roman and Greek traditions, looking at the Gauls, they would see these physical virtues. And someone who values physical prowess would look at the physical barbarian character and go, "Oh, there's something worth giving the stamp of approval to. Give us the Chuck Norris thumbs up." Then there is the guile hero, the character who outthinks his adversaries. This is different from the brawn-based Hercules. This is more the Odysseus, and while Odysseus was very physically gifted as well, I mean, far beyond his other men, he still wasn't on the level of Hercules, and it was Odysseus's mind that was his most potent tool. Guile heroes tend to outthink their enemies, and despite the barbarians' often physical depictions, particularly in Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and Blizzard's Diablo, as well as, of course, Conan the Barbarian, the one that inspired all of those three, and other versions of this archetype, the idea of cunning as a barbarian virtue is also present. You have depictions of the Native Americans using cunning against supposedly more civilized forces. You have Arminius defeating the Romans at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Through ambush. You had the Mongols, who, while often depicted as a horde, generally didn't actually outnumber their opponents and had to use clever tactics and maneuver to win their battles. And yet the Mongols are still an archetypical barbaric people. So people who value cunning and strategy and cleverness can also hold up these supposedly barbarian figures as virtuous heroes, particularly in post-colonial literature. And since I've mentioned colonialism here now, I would like to dive into, very briefly, the colonial conception of barbarian, which sort of twists the Roman conception into ends that served European imperialism, and thus have largely brought this notion into the ethnographic conceptions of racial identity that were shaped by European imperialism, not so much the ethnographic conception that would have been present in the Roman and Greek thinkers. And a lot of modern conception of the barbarian does tend to take a European West-centered focus when handling issues of colonialism, but every culture tends to have their version of the barbarian. This is not a purely colonial phenomenon, even if there's a lot of sensitivity to the colonial conception of barbarian because of what happened during colonialism. And if you've ever done a study of European colonialism, it's a rather bloody thing. But this is part of why there is such a prohibitive aversion to, say, the noble savage archetype and the even noting of certain peoples and groups as barbarians. Again, a relativistic term. And even going back to the Greeks, it was intended as somewhat demeaning by the Greeks and by the Romans, and that sort of connotation has remained in the colonial version of the apparatus. Hence why some people take offense to groups of barbarians or races of barbarians in fantasy. They go, well, you're depicting, say, certain ethnic groups that you shouldn't this way. Well, barbarian archetypes stretch beyond singular ethnic groups. And indeed, many of the cultural archetypes of the barbarians in European folklore are often constructed along the lines of images from the Gauls, the Germans, and the nomadic steppe peoples, not so much the peoples of Africa or Asia, who the Greeks would have seen as the more civilized barbarians compared to those in the north. It is the colonialist perspective that kind of has reoriented it into a more racialized context. And even then, the depictions of the colonial barbarian pull more from the Roman and Greek conception than actual historical things that many explorers witnessed. And indeed, many people who wrote travel documents would embellish and create mythologized ideas based on already pre-existing notions of what barbarians should be like, rather than what the peoples they were dealing with that they dubbed barbaric actually were like. And this notion of spiritual contamination or spiritual virtue, depending on which end of the barbarian spectrum a person is on, is what leads us into our third type of hero. The moral hero. The character is not particularly strong or not particularly clever, but holds their morals through willpower. And while this is very common in Abrahamic literature, we still see some barbarian depictions of this, particularly when you consider that a fair number of writers post-Enlightenment, and even more so post-Industrial Revolution, looked at civilization as a corrupting force that could destroy the natural virtues of people and the beauty of nature at the same time. It's not a surprise they would view the barbarian as morally superior. Again, the Greeks and the Romans already had this archetypical figure presented in the form of the noble savage. These would often be juxtaposed with images of more corrupt, debased, civilized life. So all three archetypical heroes that we could look at as paragons to emulate, or things that we would like to be as a form of wish fulfillment, are present in the old barbarian archetypes. So despite many of these cultures creating the barbarian as an other that is a threat, there is plenty to admire in the barbarian that would make it a worthy adventurer, someone that we might want to step out of real life to be. And this is an interesting deviation from the ethnographic conception of the barbarian that is the Greek or Roman version. The modern barbarian as a class or as a occupation or role is not necessarily defined by where you were born or what language you speak, but how you behave. Anyone could be the barbarian if separated from civilization. And I think this is a lot of the appeal of the barbarian character. It certainly was for the author of Conan the Barbarian, Robert E. Howard, who in many ways lived a sort of wish fulfillment through Conan, even as he depicted the world as a dark and brutal place. He levied a lot of his societal criticisms through adventure stories and weird tales. Aha, I had to slip that magazine name in there somewhere. And he also understood the world as a sort of cycle where a barbarian people overwhelmed civilization, then fed upon the riches of that civilization, eventually becoming the new civilization where barbarians would eventually overthrow them. And considering the irony of the excuses of colonialism and many colonial powers using archetypes of the barbarian when they themselves draw their nationalistic and cultural roots from the barbarian peoples who took over the Western Roman Empire and turned it into the eventual roots of Western Europe, the entire cycle of that would not have been lost on Robert E. Howard. And while Howard's view of race probably wouldn't please modern readers, the fact that Robert E. Howard shaped the modern barbarian fantasy archetype is indisputable. It is from Howard that we see the barbarian's prominence in sword and sorcery and post-sword and sorcery fantasy. Now, Robert E. Howard is not the first person to create barbarian characters in sword and sorcery. His is just the most famous. And we see many barbarian depictions throughout folklore that have stuck with us that inform the fantasy version of this. Most of the fantasy classes are built on tropes relating to real-life history and folklore, not to reality. Take a look at how we tend to view the barbarian. Just pick up a picture of a barbarian. What kind of clothes are they wearing? I'm kind of reminded of pictures of Norse berserkers who usually have an axe, bare their shirt, and stand in an icy wasteland with perhaps a bit of fur covering them. Well, this image is certainly powerful. And if you look at the helmet with horns, that ferocious looking axe, and they're usually pretty impressive physique, you get the idea that this is a hardened person who doesn't live your soft little life. This is not a person who waits in line to maybe get a PS5. This is a guy that pillages the store. You know what? Just doesn't care about the PS5 and actually goes out and does the shit that you do in video games. But even looking at that idea of the Norse berserker, there's this sort of false concept that the Vikings lived in a frozen wasteland and left because there was no food. Actually, agricultural developments led to overpopulation that led to Vikings leaving and pillaging and sometimes settling elsewhere. The term Viking refers to someone who goes a Viking. It's a occupational term, not an ethnographic term. They also did more than a little bit of trading. Indeed, probably most people's interaction was with Norse traders, not Norse raiders. But the very fact that it was a food boom and that the climate was getting a little bit warmer preceding the Viking Age, you can see already the myths that we tied to the Viking barbarian are starting to fall apart. Also, the Vikings were well armored, and also, if it was so darn cold, why are they walking around shirtless? They're not physically able to withstand the cold better than any other human being. Nah, they knew how to dress. They also used chainmail, which was the most common form of armor during the Viking Age. They were just as technologically advanced as those they pillaged. And they also were a tad bit more hygienic. As for the horns on helmet thing, I don't know where that came from, but considering Vikings tended to fight in a shield wall, that would not have been conducive to their tactical formation or activities on the field. None of those images fit with the reality of the Vikings, yet we still often depict them as barbarians, partly because they're pagan and partly because they were preying on monasteries, and the monasteries had a whole lot of literate people who would write bad things about them. Shocker, shocker, that's how it would go. In reality, the Vikings raided just about as much as everyone else did at that time. Raiding was fairly common. And even when you look back at the Romans and the Greeks, barbarians were not necessarily less sophisticated. Note, again, I say that that term is relativistic, and they certainly were not less technologically advanced in many cases. Look at the Roman legion as we see them in pop culture. The gladius is a Celtiberian sword. The scutum, that's a Celtic shield. The Romans got their iconic equipment from non-Roman and non-Italic sources. The Romans were great at incorporating other people's ideas when they worked. The Romans also incorporated barbarian auxiliary troops and allies. In many ways, the Roman army was barbarized from the get-go. And while certainly the Romans would face many less well-equipped forces during their time because of the Roman infrastructure and logistical systems, this was not always the case. Similarly, the Persian invasions of Greece saw a much more diverse and well-equipped Persian army in many cases, drawing troops through a very well-designed system of subjects and tributaries. Indeed, outside of the film 300, modern cultures might see more in common with the Persian Empire during the Greco-Persian Wars rather than the Greeks. But again, this whole idea of who is the barbarian and who is civilized is relative to the culture crafting the story. The Mongols used incredibly impressive military technology. Just look at their bows and their whole system of replacing horses in battle. A Mongol warrior would often travel with several horses that he would use for different things. And they weren't the only steppe culture to do this. There are so many cases of technological efficiency and parity in barbarian versus civilized archetypical conflicts in literature that the reality and the tropes don't necessarily mesh. Still, the tropes win out in fantasy gaming, and the barbarian tends to use less sophisticated equipment and lighter armor because that's what barbarians in storytelling tend to wear. Now, there are cases of warriors going into battle with light armor or sometimes even naked as a form of intimidation. Imagine 100 6-foot tall, well hung, painted men running at you without any clothes on, screaming at the top of their lungs. How well do you think your defensive line is going to hold up, especially if they've got a good few inches on you in height and are freaking out your fellow soldiers? When you consider that the Romans earned a lot of respect from their Italic allies by being one of the only forces to be able to withstand a Gallic charge, you can understand why this technique might have been effective, the shock and awe attack. So yes, barbarians have fought with no clothes, if you consider these people barbarians. So there is some reality behind the trope. You also have to consider what are the circumstances in which armor could be more of a problem. There is, after all, that equation of protection versus weight and limits to mobility. Now, a lot of YouTubers have demonstrated that people could do a lot of things in armor, but I want you to consider fighting in full armor and padding in a war zone for almost the entire day. What that's going to feel like, or what may be required in certain circumstances where armor should be discarded in favor of something else, like intimidation value or stealth. Or in some cases, maybe there are logistical issues that prevent certain people from getting a hold of the most modern of armors in a given time. All sorts of things could lead to people wearing lighter armors than just they're barbarians and this is the proficiency of their class. But the idea stuck. Similarly, there are constant depictions of barbarians wielding axes and the association of the axe with less civilized forces. And while some cultures depicted as barbarians did indeed use the axe quite commonly, the Vikings are famous for it, particularly if you look at the Dane axe, which is a lot thinner and more efficient than the giant two-handed axes that dominate a lot of fantasy artwork. The most common weapon among the Vikings would have been the spear. And the same can be said of a lot of cultures that are often depicted as barbaric. Spears, slings, bows, the most efficient weapons for massed warfare on the battlefield, tended to be what they used. And while the sword is an iconic fantasy weapon, it's more used as a sidearm or a status symbol than anything else. Even the samurai, who are often famed for their association with their swords, used the bow and the spear more in warfare. Just look at their formation names, and you'll see that this is the case. Now, a lot of nationalistic post-Meiji era artistic renderings of the samurai will emphasize the culture of the sword, but that is more of a cultural construction than history actually demonstrates. But that's a whole different thing. I'm looking at the barbarian, but the barbarian's creation is built on an artistic rendering of history, not history itself. Same goes for storytelling and the tropes within. Barbarians will be associated with the weapons less used by civilized forces. This includes weapons that marked cultures as an other, hence why you'll see many non-traditional weapons, at least non-traditional in the European literary context, in the hands of barbarians. So you've already got the conception of the lightly armored, perhaps even naked warrior wielding certain types of weapons. All right, now what about the rage thing? Well, many cultures, like the Greeks and the Chinese, saw the use of logic as what separated them from barbarians, and the absence of language that was tied to logic is also tied to lack of logic in others, the lack of logos, so the Greeks would have understood it. Thus, A more emotional, less disciplined and logical style of fighting would be associated with these literary archetypes. Rage, mindless, bubbling, destructive rage, is the purest form of this, and you see this represented in a lot of depictions of the barbarian. And that's before we even get into things like the Norse berserker and that association with the barbarian. Hence, this becoming a feature of the barbarian. And there's already this cultural awareness of people doing things in moments of danger or anger that seem superhuman, like mothers lifting cars off of babies and things like that. So it's an easy logical leap to see where that would become a thing. As for the ties with wilderness-based skills, perhaps even trap making and other cunning wildernessy things, that's also very much present in that civilization versus wilderness dichotomy we see in stories that frame the barbarian as something separate from the civilized character. Thus, you can see how the core components of the barbarian class came to be, and why we would look at these figures as possible heroes as well as villains. There's a reason that we still are concerned with this dichotomy, and we still feel a kinship with the barbarian or feel fear towards the barbarian. And these things exist regardless of culture, regardless of whether you think of the barbarian in the Western context or in some other culturally specific form. There are parts of us that fear the system, that see the debauchery of things associated with civilization, that see dishonor in laws that can compel people to do things that are wrong. And these are the sorts of things that would cause someone to value the virtue and strength of the barbarian, making the barbarian a very compelling class for this sort of person. Similarly, we can see barbarians as the villains because they exist outside the law, outside of civilization. Civilization's a fragile thing, and once it breaks down, we are exposed to the natural order, and nature is very mean and vicious. When you don't have laws to protect you, the strong can simply take from you what they want or kill you. If you don't have reason, emotions and rage and fear are what matter. And if you don't have infrastructure, starvation and poverty occur, and destruction of infrastructure can come with the onrushing horde of adversaries, whatever these adversaries might be. Whether it's the Gaijin invading Japan or the Huns knocking on Rome's door, there is the idea that an outside force that you see as less culturally sophisticated than you could ruin what beautiful thing you've created for yourself. Thus, the fear of the outsider, the fear of the supposedly less sophisticated, the fear of the culturally different is similarly represented, as well as the fear of the laws of nature over the laws of man, and the pitiless survival of the fittest that breaks with the virtue of civilization. All of these can mark the barbarian as a villain worthy of pitting some heroes against. And these figures can commingle. The strong could serve the purpose of good, or can serve the purpose of evil. Righteous rage can break the chains, whereas mindless berserker fury destroys without pity. To GMs and players alike, I suggest you consider these ideas when working with the barbarian, in judging why we can think of barbaric heroes or barbaric adversaries, the cultural context of the barbarian in whatever story you are attempting to weave. And most of all, I talk about these things hoping that you'll have a good time listening. Anyway, I plan to do a whole series based on the cultural context of certain classes and where they come from, in hopes that you'll find it fun. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, who knows. But I'm still probably going to do it anyway. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Take care.